hello and welcome. Thank you to everyone for joining us this lunchtime, and a double thank you to those who I spotted from our call yesterday evening. You are truly conducting the Co-operative Party Zoom marathon, and I'm very pleased to see you again. I am Anna Birley, for any of you who haven't met me on one of these before. I'm the Policy Officer for the Co-operative Party and sometimes star of the Zoom screen. And I host these chats every Wednesday lunchtime with different representatives from the movement, from our parliamentary party, from other third sector and cooperative organisations that we work with on topics that I hope you find topical and thought-provoking. Today our focus is on inequality. We're going to be looking at it from two different but obviously very interlinked angles. We're going to be joined by Florence Eshalomi MP, who's one of our newest Labour and cooperative groups and is joining us hot off the press from a call with the BBC. So that is fabulous. And also Greg Beales, who is a director at Shelter, who's going to be looking at some of the housing inequalities and deprivation and some of the experience that Shelter's been having through this crisis. This links really nicely with the report we launched yesterday, Owning the Future, which looks at the link between inequality and some of the structural problems in our economy, and how when we seek to regrow and come out of recession after this crisis, we need to take a different approach to our economy to try and avoid some of this inequality and tackle its root causes as well. So really good to have some experts with us on the line. I'm going to do a very quick bit of housekeeping. Those of you who have been with us before know that we record these sessions. This is because not everyone can join us live on a Wednesday and they like to catch up in their own time on YouTube. So if you're not dressed, please turn your video off now. You can find that on most devices at the bottom left hand of your screen. We will have time for Q&A, and I hope that you have all got some interesting and thoughtful questions prepared. In order to ask a question, there are a number of ways you can get involved. I can't see all of your faces on the screen at once, so instead of putting an actual hand up, please can you put a virtual hand up using the participate button at the bottom of your screen. That lets me know that you want to say something. You can also use the chat function to myself or to the Cooperative Party, which is my colleague Izzy, who's monitoring that through the call, and let us know that you want to ask a question, or if you'd like us to ask one for you and you'd like to type it out, that is also fine. If you're struggling with either of those, events@party.coop is an email address you can use to get hold of Izzy as well. And I think without too much further ado, I'm going to hand straight over to Greg. Any of you who joined us at our Common Decency conference a couple of years ago in Amnesty's buildings will have met Greg before. He made some really interesting contributions around our housing crisis, and I'm sure that he'll be able to expand on ways that this crisis have really made those, accentuated some of those challenges and created new ones that we need some good policy solutions to tackle. So over to you, Greg.
Definitely. Thank you ever so much for having me today. I'm pleased to say I am fully dressed and also have a very, very new baby at home. So if I'm looking a little bit distracted during this, then ask for apologies in advance. What I mainly wanted to just do this lunchtime is talk a bit about what we as an organisation are seeing on the front line, what the experience of people at the sharp end of this housing system looks like at the moment. I think people be familiar with the idea that one of the core features of the way our housing market works, really one of the core impacts of it is that it puts far too many people in a very precarious position. There's the famous line about a majority of us only being a couple of paychecks away from homelessness, which is in some senses true, in some senses true. But for a lot of people in the system, their interaction with housing, how they pay for it, where they live and so on, is a fundamental part of an insecurity in their lives. And then what we've seen with the pandemic is really that be exacerbated massively, a sort of huge pressure on people, depending on the housing and the housing situation that they're in. And I mean, really what we're seeing, I suppose, is first the pandemic itself, then the experience of lockdown, be incredibly disproportionately felt by people, depending on where they are in the housing system, depending on the resources that they have to draw on, partly socioeconomic status, but not just that. And then we're obviously expecting now to see a further sort of economic hit potentially a tsunami of evictions and so on coming down the tracks, which I think, again, will be very disproportionately felt depending on the resources people have. So, look, just to sort of go through this, what are we seeing? We've had a huge increase in the number of people coming to Shelter for Help. For those of you who know or who don't know about the organisation, we run national advice telephone, digital. We did run face-to-face services, but obviously those have been quite heavily affected by lockdown. And anyone that's getting into difficulty can come to us. We'll triage you and treat some of the emergency. 60% of all the 60% of all those inquiries coming in, people seeking help, are now directly related in some way to coronavirus. So that shows you the way in which the events have had an impact on the housing system. And I wanted to sort of wanted to just read a quote from one of our advisors in Bristol. This was a lady, lovely lady, rang on the telephone. She said, sobbing after receiving an eviction notice, trying to look after a family, having been told to shield, so having been told by the government to shield, to then be dealing with an eviction notice that required her to move out at that stage in 8 weeks' time. And that's really placing people in, at that point was putting people in completely, as you can see, impossible situation. So, but what are the issues here? Well, the biggest issue now for us, the biggest volume of people, are those coming to us because they've lost a job, reduced income, and cannot afford to pay rent, bills, and food. And we estimate now that there are 600,000 people who are behind on their rent. So they're in rent arrears of some form. Obviously, at the point at which that becomes 2 months rent arrears, in normal times, they are able to be evicted with very little ability to defend yourself in the courts. I don't know if people know, but the government have introduced, partly, I think, our strong urging, have introduced a suspension in all evictions at the moment. So currently you can't take eviction proceedings through the courts. The courts will not hear them. That's recently been extended to run to the end of August. But effectively, as you can imagine, effectively what is happening is a rising number of people are getting into a position where they are in rent arrears, are unable to pay their rent, unable to make up the rent payments that they've missed. And really what we expect to see is a rising number of people who will, at the end of that suspension, face eviction proceedings. So, I mean, the government are right to want to push it as far as possible down the line, but when it comes, if we haven't changed the regime, if we haven't done something, we really face the risk of a wave of evictions. We've also been seeing people becoming homeless during the pandemic. You might say, why, if eviction proceedings aren't happening? But we've seen people fleeing domestic violence, homeless because for the reason they've taken the step to get out of a dangerous home situation. We've seen people illegally evicted, in some cases forced to leave family accommodation, and we've even seen some. You might have seen us talk about this in the media, but we've even seen some healthcare workers locked out of their shared properties because other residents were concerned that they might catch coronavirus from a healthcare worker. So these are all the sort of problems that have been affecting people during the period of the lockdown. To add to that, if you're a renter and you've been waiting for urgent repairs, it's been very hard to get those done. So the quality of accommodation has suffered. And probably above all, really, and I think it's just one of the things I really wanted to mention this lunchtime, above all, I think the experience for people during lockdown, depending on the resources at their disposal, and in particular the type of housing and accommodation they're in, has been absolutely night and day. You know, I speak for myself. I know many people sort of listening today will have been able to lock down in a home that they're comfortable in, with a bit of space, maybe with a bit of garden space, and be able to effectively live a limited but a reasonable way to live like that. At the other extreme, we've got more than 80,000 people in temporary accommodation at the moment. Temporary accommodation, I mean, that often means a single room, with a family sharing that single room, maybe shared bathroom facilities, which make it effectively impossible to shield yourself from other families and other users of that housing. But even if you haven't got shared bathroom facilities, a 1-room or 2-room temporary accommodation building is obviously an awful experience for a family to be locking down and limiting themselves. And so just vast difference in experiences depending on the resources that you've got at your disposal. And part of the challenge for us in this period has been there isn't much you can do for someone where they're in temporary accommodation. Hopefully at some point they will move through that system and into social housing, into the routes out of temporary accommodation. But obviously during lockdown, moving people out has not been an option, and therefore people have been in a really difficult position where they're having to make choices about whether they obey the rules, protect their families, or really look after their mental health, because being in one room for a period of weeks is really difficult. I think we're also very conscious that that experience of the housing system is not evenly spread. So, for example, just looking at London alone, 3% of white British households are in overcrowded accommodation. 12% of BAME households are in overcrowded accommodation, and that rises to 16-17% for some specific ethnic groups, including Black British. And so what you're looking at is a very uneven, in socioeconomic terms and also in race terms, a very uneven spread of the impact of the lockdown and the experiences that that people are having. And of course, we don't know all the reasons why COVID has such a disproportionate impact on ethnicity, but it seems unavoidable to conclude. And I know the government published research sort of points in this direction as well, that housing is a big part of that, the presence of overcrowding in housing, as well as housing density, is playing a big part in transmission and the likelihood of transmitting COVID, particularly to other family members. So I don't want to go on for too long, but what are we calling for? What have we been saying to government in this time they need to do? And actually, for people that want to get involved, we've put together a joint call with other homelessness organisations, so Homeless Link, Centre Point, St Mungo's, Crisis, DePaul, because we felt this was such an urgent time. It was a time for people to come together and be very clear with the government on what was needed and what the responses needed. So in the short run, it's about moving everyone at risk of rough sleeping into long-term support. The government have made a lot of moving people off the streets, but it is clearly not enough to move people off the streets if you don't provide them a route into a secure, stable home down the line. And at the moment, that is not in place. At the moment, we run a huge risk that people who have been brought off the streets will in fact move back onto the streets as part of the easing of lockdown measures. The second thing is to prevent evictions. And the government have done that now through to the end of August. So we've got this eviction ban in place until the end of August, but we really must now focus on trying to secure some changes to the rules for the end of that suspension, so that people who are in rent arrears, who are for other reasons might be facing a no-fault eviction, for example, from a landlord that's just decided they maybe don't want a healthcare worker living in their promised property. We're going to need more protections for that post suspension period. Otherwise, we are going to have a wave of evictions, and I know there's a lot of speculation about how many that might be. And then, lastly, we need the third of the immediate things. We're calling for an increase in housing benefit to the average rent. We've obviously got a period where we're going to have far more people depending on the welfare, social security safety net that exists. That's only really going to work for most people if housing benefit covers average rents rather than the lower third. And so we think that's whether that's a long-term change or even just a short-term change, we think that would make a real difference now to keep people in their homes. And just let me just say one more thing before Flo comes in. I think for us, the real lesson for us, and I hope for government, for policymakers, I hope for the cooperative party, the real lesson about this is if we want to build a system which gives people resilience, which allows them through an economic crisis or a health crisis to protect themselves, look after themselves, protect their family, then you have to build the foundations of that system. And that means social housing. There really is no substitute in this world. There is no substitute for having a secure home with a rent linked to incomes, set based on incomes, and which you have the ability to stay in, provided you're playing by the rules. If we had more social housing now, it is unquestionable that we would be in a stronger position economically. It's probable, not a doctor, but it's probable that we would be in a position to slow the spread of the virus as well. And certainly if we were building these things now, we'd be in a better position economically with the jobs and so on that we'd be creating. So for us, that's the huge lesson that we want government to take away.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Greg. And that was a vast amount of information sort of condensed down into a very manageable amount of time and put really clearly. So thank you. And I think we were commenting before the call that for those of us who lockdown isn't a hugely uncomfortable experience, we don't see that our next door neighbours may be in cramped accommodation. I think that's the really shocking thing around issues to do with housing, is that so much of it's hidden. I'm really excited that we have Florence Eshalomi, one of our newest MPs in Vauxhall. She wrote for us last week around issues to do with racism, race, and the PHE report, and some of the deep inequalities that Greg touched on around housing, but also more widely around mortality during COVID. So hot off a call with the BBC, we're able to welcome Flo, who I think's unmuted herself, so I will hand straight over.
Thanks a lot, Anna. Can you all hear me?
Yes. Yeah, that's perfect.
And thank you to the Co-op Party for organising this really important series, which I think it is important that we continue to talk, but it really equally important for us to look at what solutions we as the Co-op group and our movement want to bring for the wider labour movement in responding and addressing these key issues. And I think the report just recently released by the Co-op highlights what we all know already. Inequality is there, inequality continues to grow, and inequality seems to be this new hot topic now. And we've seen the inequality growing disproportionately in some of our communities, predominantly our BME communities and those in lower incomes. And what COVID-19 has done is exposed what was already there in a really fragile state. For me, the wider impact of COVID-19 and the government's response needs to bring home the reality of how we're going to respond in terms of responding on not just health inequalities, not just racial inequality, but also financial inequality, which I think is the key driver to this. The report states that the amount of, I think this statistic is that the 10% of households, the 10 richest percent of households amount 44% of all wealth. That should send alarm bells ringing. I think the fact that we have seen the government over the last 10 years, firstly under coalition government, then under Theresa May, and now obviously under Boris, brand this figure of we've got record levels of people in work. But when you dig into those figures, you'll see that actually they're talking about people in low paid work, people on 0-hour contracts, people in insecure jobs. And we know that those jobs are not sustainable. We know that those jobs are the root cause of some of the inequality we see. And as we continue to see the wealth in our country accumulate in the hands of a very small few, we need to look at how we challenge that. And I think I'm so excited and obviously biased that we have Annalise Dodds as the new shadow chancellor. And I think, with her being a co-op member as well, we are going to see some of those distribution and what we want to see in terms of more public ownership, more mutuals coming through on the Labour agenda. If I look at what I've received in my inbox over the last few months as a relatively new MP, all the issues that Greg touched on, that's been the biggest thing for me. Housing across Vauxhall is such a major issue. Housing across most inner London constituencies is a major issue. I've been working with a group of my councillors from 2 particular wards in trying to get one of our housing associations not to implement a 22% rent increase during this pandemic. When we know that people have been laid off, when we know people have been furloughed, when we know people may not have a job to go back to, a housing association which is supposed to provide that key housing for people on lower income thinks it's right to put up their rent by 22%. And we're talking the figures of around £180 to £240 per month. So I've been fighting that. And the only reason we can get the kind of housing we need, not just in Vauxhall, but right across the country, is how do we get that house building programme that Greg touched on across the country? How do we get councils to borrow directly from the government to build the kind of housing we want? And when we look at the housing we've already got, we know that a number of them are substandard. We know that a number of people in private rented accommodation having to rent accommodation that's below standards, having to pay those extortionate rents to landlords who frankly just don't care. When we look at the fact that over this pandemic, a number of my constituents in Vauxhall have been having to live in those cramped accommodations, and we're talking about a family with a single mother and in some cases 4 children in 1 bedroom. Whereas before, that family would have gone to school. That mother may have gone to her part-time work. They are now having to spend 24 hours in that 1 room with no access to a garden. So it brings home some of those deep-seated inequalities that we've been seeing. And over the last week and a half, where we've seen people take to the streets on the back of the tragic killing that we saw in America, it shows again some of the issues around racial inequality, which we know also exists within our country. And I think, again, for us as co-op members, we need to look at how do we respond and how do we address that. We know that as the co-op, that community of working and supporting each other, that's one way we can bring about that change. We need to harness that in all the different groups that are formed up and down the country. Harness that to make sure that we develop those groups and making sure those groups are reflective of the society, making sure that those groups include young people, they include BME people, making sure that our party as well, we try and recruit more people. And I think lastly, it's a case of how do we look at those key arts that we want the government to come back with? When we see the government releasing the report like the Public Health England report, but yet take out that key recommendation, we need to be asking those questions. We need to get some people to email us as parliamentarians to raise those questions. We can't continue to wait for review after review where the government don't implement any of the recommendations. And when there are recommendations, they do act on them. I think the last thing that I'll touch on is about the structural inequality that we are seeing across society, and how it's about how we have a conversation in terms of what our alternative will be and how we can respond to that. And I think the key thing for me as a Labour Co-op MP representing an Inland London borough is about what I think is about redistributing that wealth, which I think is central to all of this. Thank you, Anna.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. And I appreciate you've had such a busy day. I'm really grateful that you're able to join us. So I'm going to, if Florence and Greg, you both are sort of poised to unmute, and I will open up to questions. A few of you have been in touch, but don't forget that you can also use either the chat function or the participate button to indicate that you'd like to ask a question. I've had one first from Joyce Nicoll has emailed, so I will find Joyce and unmute you if you'd like to ask. I think you've sent quite a long document, so if you ask the short version, then we can get more questions and that would be great. Joyce, it's not letting, there we go.
Yeah,
perfect. Hello.
Very good. Okay, I put through an email there that highlighted a couple of systemic issues that are going on. Basically, the UK is in a backward position where everything just becomes part of politics, and there are systemic things that we can improve. There has been much mention of housing rights and the lack of them in meaning and effect, and of economic inequality. And all of this homes back to the fact that Britain signed up to the socioeconomic rights, but has not given it effect for ordinary people, and there's no need to do impact assessments on when things disproportionately affect people of lower socioeconomic income. And also you've got no right to your housing to be treated as a home, instead of which it's treated as a property speculation asset, okay? And so there are things that can be done, particularly as MPs. So one thing, and excuse me if I'm sounding as if I'm just giving you a shopping list of things to do, but for example, get Section 1 of the Equalities Act enacted. Secondly, put back in the 4 words that were taken out of the Equalities Act when the different bits of statute were pulled together. And these are the words "or any other status" in the definition of the protected groups. Because if you put that back in, then things like single parent families were so affected, then things like people who are sitting in a lower socioeconomic band, then things like students' housing rights, all start to require to have impact assessments on decisions that are done. And there also starts to be a necessity to do these things. But really, instead of picking off little bits around the edges, we are seeing how the combination of Brexit and COVID is revealing how flawed things are in Britain, and things need to change. And one of the things that cuts across the board and is absolutely true to our cooperative values and to Labour values, but indeed to decent people, is to have a duty of care of the state towards its own citizens, towards your health, towards your housing, towards your affordability of living. And that comes in if we put in an opposition bill that says we hereby enact
Joyce,
what we've promised to do. Okay, so housing rights can be much more equal. They're better in the devolved area. England misses out because it's not obliged to the international law. So
brilliant. And I'll forward your note to Florence so she's got the long version. Thank you. Anne, I think you had your hand up and have posted a question, so I'll unmute you now. Anne? For some reason,
hello?
Oh, there you go. There you
Hi.
are. Hi.
I was really interested to hear Greg's comments, and well, horrified 600,000 people are going to be in rent arrears. And I've been working with many colleagues on how we can support those in debt so that their mental health is not further damaged. And the Mental Health Organisation released in March how COVID-19 inequality is going to severely impact the mental health of people in debt. You're probably aware people with mental health problems are already 3 times more likely to have financial difficulty. And just wondering how, as members of the Co-operative Party, we can do something to address this, to just destigmatise mental health and actually help people access debt management.
Oh, sorry, I need to do slightly too quickly, sorry. But if I hand over to Greg and Florence, if you've got some thoughts both around how we upgrade our equalities legislation so that it is more inclusive of all of the different inequalities we see in the country, and also how we provide that mental health support to people who are particularly impacted by the inequalities that they face during this crisis. Should we kick off with you, Florence?
Yeah, no, totally agree. I think in terms of looking at Section 1 around the socio-economic disadvantages, and the fact that this government felt it right when they were doing universal credit changes, withdrawing key support for under 25s, the whole issue around bedroom tax, and changes in terms of child benefit. You can see if all of those had that proper equality impact assessment, the government would not have proceeded with those changes, but frankly, they just don't care. So hence why I said that inequality, financial inequality is the link in terms of all of this. So I'm happy if Anna sends that to me, I'm happy to raise that with my other colleagues. We've got our parliamentary co-op meeting at 3 o'clock this afternoon, so I'll raise it there with colleagues. In terms of your point, Anne, housing and mental health, just really, really important and a really important issue. And I had a call a few weeks ago with former Lib Dem MP, Sir Norman Lamb, who is now the chair of one of our mental health hospitals in South London called South London Maudsley. It's actually sits in Helen Hayes' constituency, but it serves Lambeth and Southwark, and as far as Croydon and Lewisham areas, so it serves a number of South London boroughs. And it's one of the only major mental health A&E hospitals in the country. So, you know, really, really vital facility there. And one of the things I asked him on his call is how the hospital we work in to not just help their day-to-day patients, but the fact that more and more people are going to be presenting with mental health now. And, you know, what outreach and community, because, you know, we all know it's better to have those services within the community, what additional community support they'll be given to help address that. Because you're going to find a number of people who've never needed to access mental health now going through that because their impact on finances, they may not have a job to go back to. That's going to affect them. I think the key thing we need to make sure we are doing is people are being open and honest. There is still a stigma around mental health. Again, a massive stigma around young people coming forward with their mental health and BAME people talking about mental health. Again, I spoke to a group of young people, year 11 students, who were due to sit their exams, and now all of that's been cancelled. And one of the young girls said that she feels, you know, she's never felt so stressed in her life. And she's worried about what her grades are going to be because her teacher's going to mark that. So again, making sure those services are there for our young people. So it is really, really important that we do raise that with the added complexity, with the added pressures of COVID and what's to come down the line. Just remember, as we're starting to rebuild the economy, as we're starting to see people go back to work, there are a number of people where things will not go back to normal. So firstly, we need to make sure that those services are there for them to talk. And if it's that they do need longer term support, that those services can cope with helping them.
Great. And Greg, is there anything you're able to add on those topics?
Well, great questions. So great questions. I'll just be quick. Look, I 100% agree with Joyce on implementing Section 1 of the Equality Act. I think it will make a big difference. And I mean, in my role, I'm constantly amazed at how decisions get made in government, Joyce. I mean, I don't know about everybody else, but watching the government talk about following the science in relation to COVID, following the experts, has made me think, why can't we follow the experts in other policy areas? You know, like you know, dealing with hunger and inequality and, you know, sorting out homelessness. I mean, there are experts in all these areas. Apparently, it's only on COVID where we're going to follow expert advice, and we're just sort of winging it everywhere else. So I totally agree with that. And then Anne, just on the debt advice point, I think this is so important. So, and I don't know if you saw it, really interesting report from the Resolution Foundation said that where people can, they're paying down debt. So in preparation for the recession to come. But of course, 40% of high earners are paying down debt. It's just 5% of the lowest income group because people can't pay down debt at that point. And so it seems to me that like debt is going to be a huge part of this. And the stigma around that is, I mean, I totally agree with what Flo's saying about the stigma. I just wonder if there are some signs as we go into this recession that we might be able to do some things differently. So, you know, I think the fact that it is COVID, that it's linked to this disease, means that some of those old arguments about, well, it's your own fault, just can't apply. You know, it's not your fault if you work for an airline and you lose your job because people aren't flying as much. And so I wonder if it is an opportunity as well to challenge some of the stigma, challenge the stereotypes, and say, look, that this is the safety net has to be there for all of us for times like this, because we don't know, you know, what's around the corner.
Absolutely. Right, so the next round, Mark, I think, had some really interesting questions on disability and housing, so I'll unmute you, but a heads up to Tina and Javeria, I will be coming to you next, okay? Mark, Bryant, there we go.
Hello, yes. I'd like to ask about the impact of the disability on homelessness, and in particular, if there are any information about the proportion of homeless people who are disabled compared with the number of disabled people in the population at large, and also the to what extent disabled people can achieve the aspirations set out in the UN Convention of the Rights of Disabled with Disabilities to choose their place of residence, and you know, and get housing rights on the same basis with other people.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. And Javeria, I will unmute you now.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. Nice to see Florence and also Greg here, and also Chris as well. Just a quick point, if I may. It's also important that now is also the time that we also challenge the inequalities that are faced by women, and also ensure that economic justice is available for women, because as per the previous financial crisis, it was women that actually obviously were impacted heavily, and they still haven't received the economic justice that they needed. Also, the gig economy workers, whilst we were under lockdown, a lot of us were staying at home or working from home, but there were people on 0-hour contracts, for instance, who had to go out there and actually had to work because they had to earn a living. It was either going out to work or starving, not being able to feed their families. So that's really important that we also tackle that. And the other point is also, we also need to tackle the economic inequalities faced by our SMEs, because our small businesses make up, you know, the backbone of many communities. And it looks as though that, I mean, they are being given some sort of financial compensation from the government, but it's not enough. I mean, most of those businesses still won't see, even if they do reopen, it's going to take them a long time to actually trade, in order to be able to pay their bills. So I mean, it's really important that also our SMEs aren't forgotten. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. And Tina, I'll unmute you now.
Hello, I was just wondering how we go about fixing the issue that councils can't obtain a housing account to build more council housing without actually having the current housing stock to mortgage against it. So if you're in a situation where the local council's previous administration has sold that all off, what do you actually do?
Great, thank you very much, Tina, and also for a nice short question as well. Always helps us get longer answers. I think, Javeria, the point you made around gig economy and people going back to work, and I think this is going to reveal that Greg and I probably read a lot of the same things, but I think it was a Resolution Foundation did some looking into actually the people on lowest incomes have seen their working hours increase, while the people on the higher incomes are seeing the number of hours they spend sort of doing things to do with work, like commuting, go down because they're working from home. So it's a really interesting one to raise. Because we did Florence first last time. Greg, if you're able to kick off on those three.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, so sort of let me sort of take them in reverse order, just because that's how I've written them down. So Tina asked, what can you do if you don't have sort of housing stock as a local authority? Well, the answer is, you know, some, but not as much as is possible. And I think it's really important to recognise that the answer on social housing and council house building is that local authorities can do some things, but they fundamentally operate in a national policy framework, and we will not get the amount of housing that we need built unless we're able to secure changes to the national policy framework. I mean, you might conclude that we have too centralised a country and that more power should be sort of offered, you know, given locally, and that shouldn't be the case. But as things stand, it's going to be a combination of national and local changes that are needed. The government have relaxed the thing that they introduced, which was the caps on borrowing, but obviously you've got to have the assets to borrow against to be able to take advantage of those. I think there are some things that local authorities though can be doing. So section 106, I don't want to get too technical, but basically there are rules in place that allow local authorities to set a proportion, I mean, I know you'll know this, a proportion of development for a social purpose, which can include social housing. I mean, there are some local authorities that do it well and some that are basically pushed over by developers. And the challenge there is to set high targets. We would say make sure that you're using it for social housing, not to build a police station or something. And then really standing up to the developers when they try and use the rules to get around those rules. And, you know, it's the local authorities that are doing that are able to bring through some homes that housing associations can then buy and social homes. So there are some things, but undoubtedly there are big policy changes that we need. And it is crackers that local authorities aren't able to borrow at a time of record low interest rates, because this is exactly the sort of way that you make an investment in the country's future. Let me answer Mark, and then I'm going to leave the other ones for Flo, I think. So Mark was asking specifically about disabilities. So you clearly you are more likely to be on a you are more likely to be using the benefit system, the social security system, if you have a disability. I think you're twice more likely overall across everything. And there's a direct correlation between the people that need support and the people end up facing homelessness, and that's because that's a pretty patchy system, and that does not catch everybody at every point. So there is a conveyor belt, if you like, from the one to the other. That said, there are, parts of that system can catch you on the way. And, we as an organisation spend quite a lot of time making sure people are aware about the entitlements that they have and making sure that they're in a position to apply for them, because the system doesn't make it as easy as possible. And certainly, I think once you are able to access disability living allowance component, for example, that definitely makes a difference and gives people some protection against homelessness. But there's clearly a link and a conveyor belt from one to the other.
And then Flo, if you want to pick up any of those questions that you're able to touch on.
Yeah, just again, in reverse order, I think it is important that we look at the whole issue around house building. But I think another area which sometimes we don't talk about enough is the private rented sector. The reality is more and more people are going to have to rent. We need a whole-scale reform in the private rented sector. And this was something that obviously Shelter covered a few months ago in terms of looking at rent caps. I think now is the time for us to be bold in terms of speaking about that. And I think that report highlighted that this wasn't just Labour people who wanted this, it was cross-party. So we do need to start having those discussions, especially in inner London cities like London, where we know that, I think people are paying around close to about 45% of their income on rent. That's just not sustainable. We simply can't build enough to keep up with the demand. So we need to look at alternative forms of housing. And we should also be looking at trying to work with developers in terms of co-op housing as well. That seems to have gone quiet. We need to bring back that agenda. Let's talk about building some of those co-op housing. Obviously we had the first ones in Lambeth. Let's talk about where those new lands are coming, having those discussions with councils. In terms of the issues around SMEs and the private and people on the gig economy, this has been a key thing for my inbox over the last few months. Across Vauxhall, we have so many people that are self-employed and who are freelancers, who through, whether it's because of the way they pay via PAYE or dividends, they haven't been able to access any of the government support over the last 10 to 10 weeks. Those people have effectively been using their private savings, which in effect is their pensions, to sustain themselves over those last 8 to 10 weeks. Those people are now facing a future which is so bleak. They're now thinking, where do I turn to? I've got a number of small businesses that were not able to qualify for any of the grants. There was the 10,000 and 25,000 grant. The only option available to those small businesses was to take out a loan. And yes, it was a loan on favourable terms. But when you're looking at the fact that your business may not open again, taking on that loan is such a big risk. I've been trying to push the government to look at the rateable value, especially, again, apologies, I'm sounding London-centric, but especially, again, because the rateable values of businesses in London are much higher. So a number of those businesses didn't qualify for any of those loans. I had a discussion with some of my businesses, and the Federation of Small Business held that call. And we were looking at the fact that there's been no holidays for those small businesses that pay into their business improvement districts bids. But yet there's been a holiday for business rates. So one of the things I lobbied for was a bid holiday for a year. The government came back and didn't agree to that, but they gave a number of the bids across the country a pot of money. So there are so many things that, we have to look at in terms of getting those key small businesses, which we know they invest in local people by employing them. They invest in the community. They support council events. They support community events. Without those small businesses, all of our community events would not thrive. I know what the value of those small SME businesses. So it's important that we get them to kickstart the economy. And lastly, the point in terms of housing and adaptable housing for disabled people. We still know, again, and I'm sure Greg's got data on this, we still know that if you're disabled, trying to rent in the private rented sector, there's still a lot of discrimination going on there. You've got landlords that will refuse to make those adaptations. You've got councils who will be shirking their social responsibilities of making those adaptations, making sure those properties are DDA compliant. So again, we need to make sure we'll continue to push on that really important agenda and make sure that our housing is fit for purpose for everybody.
Let me just very quickly jump back in on that last point, because that's so important, Flo. The thing people will see if they try and rent a flat sometimes is this little phrase, no DSS, no Department for Social Security. And what it means is the landlord is prepared to rent the flat for a particular price, but they're not prepared to rent it to you if you are receiving, if you're depending on the welfare system. Now, particularly people with disabilities, that obviously affects. By the way, our view is that's completely illegal. We're bringing cases now against landlords who do that successfully through the courts. It's clearly indirect discrimination. If people want to know more about that, please do contact me on Twitter on any of these campaigns. There's opportunities for people to support those cases as well. But just, I mean, that is just a basic form of discrimination that's become embedded in the housing system, just taken for granted by letting agents and others, that they can put this no DSS on when, you know, it has a huge impact on people in the system, exactly as you describe.
And on that call to action, and I'm sure that lots of us on the call will be very keen to get in touch with both Greg and Flo about some of those areas that you're working on respectively to get the law to take these inequalities into account better and to tackle people who discriminate, whether it's by disability, by race, by income, and try and make a fairer system. I'll certainly look to circulate any sort of links to campaigning asks or anything that members can do to help. So please do let me funnel them on to people on this call. But I'm going to call it a day, as I've kept you all for 50 minutes and I'm hugely grateful for your time. So thank you very much, Flo. Thank you very much, Greg. Thank you everyone for joining and for the thoughtful questions. And my big sorry to everybody who had a hand up and we didn't get onto this time. I've made a note of your questions and they're certainly on issues we hope to be able to address in the future. So without further ado, those councillors on the call, maybe see you this evening at 6 for our local government call, and otherwise I hope to see you next week. Thank you very much. Thanks, Greg and Flo.